Thank you ever so much for coming. Can you hear me at the back okay? Great. It's lovely to be back. Lovely to see all of you. My main aim today is to not annoy you. But there's a warning that I might, because the subject I'm going to talk about is kind of quite close to the bone. But I honestly think we should talk about it. You've all been told, I think, when you write essays, to write about your own positionality and think who you are and your privilege and how that affects you. The thing we really ignore in geography, is the positionality of the discipline as a whole. It's a kind of dirty secret that we don't like to talk about or think isn't very important. But I happen to think it's much more important than any individual's own position. And by important, I mean it actually determines almost everything that happens in geography departments. It determines the kind of research people do, what they think is important, what becomes normal. If you were to look at geography journals from the 1950s or 60s, you'll see they look at very different things. You might say, oh, it's all out of date, it was colonial, whatever. But it wasn't just that. I was a student, I was at your position in the 1980s. I'm there wearing very proudly my £150 leather jacket purchased at Debenhams in Oxford because I thought I was so cool and I'm smug, up in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1986. Those are our first year photographs of most of the intake. That's the majority of what a year would have been. Back in 1986, the number of students was almost identical to the number of academics. Right? And the academics complained they were overworked. Right? And how terrible it was. And we were very privileged. I mean, that's the reason to put this up. You know, I went to university at a time when far fewer people went. Maybe about 6% nationally went. But from an average median comprehensive, it would be just 2%, only 1 in 50 would go. Once you're in, you're safe. You might not know that, but once you got to university, that was it. You were safe for life in terms of jobs and whatever else happens. Whereas you lot, I'm afraid, are not. Even though you've gone to Cambridge, you're not. And you probably know that. It's part of the anxiety. Anyway, I come from a time of privilege. I'll probably mention it later, but you can ask me. I come from a family of privilege. My parents were both Oxford University graduates. They both had a brother who was an Oxford University graduate, so that's 2 uncles. My cousin hates me mentioning that she went to college. My grandfather went to an Oxford college, and my great-aunt beat him by going to Somerville first. We're talking 1930s, okay? I'm a posh boy. Right? This is not a chip-on-the-shoulder thing. Although I wasn't as posh as many of my contemporaries at Newcastle, which was interesting back then. Maybe I'll say more about that later, maybe not. I get involved in things that gets me or has got me in the press more in the past than now. This is one of my greatest honours. Fraser Nelson really, really didn't like me. Fraser Nelson was the editor of Spectator for a time. Interestingly, politics has moved so far to the right in Britain that Fraser is now quite a reasonable, middle-of-the-road, one-nation conservative. And there's been a number in the last few months of people who were on the right 10 years ago now saying, why are we being so mean about refugees being able to be reconnected with their families? Anyway, Fraser didn't like me. So I get things like find 3 inaccuracies in my work as being one of the conditions for winning one of their internships as a spectator. He would never tell me what errors they found. Anyway. And this kind of thing. I was one of the many academics who signed the thing saying we're never going to go into Oriel College, Oxford, while they keep the statue above the top. There is this, if you don't know, above what was the old entranceway to Oriel College is Cecil Rhodes statue. Cecil Rhodes is a mass murderer and a racist. There is no equivalent anywhere in Europe of any university of anybody as obnoxious as Cecil Rhodes above the entrance. And they just keep it up there to spite. There were campaigns to get rid of it. It was almost got rid of. Well, you take the statue and you put it inside rather than have it on the highest plinth in the public high street. But you get complaints of things like, why on earth could I do that when my chair was named after a little murderer? He only ordered the murder of 8 people. We found out recently he was very interested in torturing people to death, at which point my university was willing to change the name of my job. It's interesting at what point they do it. The Cecil Rhodes, the Rhodes Chair of Race Relations at the University of Oxford, is no longer the Rhodes Chair of Race Relations. There are buildings that have changed their name. The trick of Oxford and Cambridge is to take the money. We always say we could do better with the money. The money very often comes from a man who wants to make his reputation look better than it is. We don't say much about it because the man tends to have very expensive lawyers, and it's defamation while he's alive to complain about the big donors. But the names don't last forever, but you have to give them the idea that the name will last forever to get the millions from them. Anyway, I wrote an article in 2019 in an obscure geography journal called Emotion and Society, I think. This chapter in a book which was published this year called Making Geography Matter is about the effects of that article and what happened afterwards. Harry, I think, was a Telegraph journalist in 2019. And tabloid papers had picked up that I'd written this article and decided that I had labelled geography as posh and dim. Now, I'd labelled it as posh. I hadn't labelled it as dim, but anyway. But you can see it causes annoyance. I paid £70 for the copyright of Harry's photograph so I can use it in publications now. Yes, I might be slightly childish. Harry did his undergraduate degree in my department in Oxford. Okay. Things changed between when I was born and when I was a student in the mid-80s and now. You almost certainly know this. The UK went from being one of the most equitable countries in Europe to becoming the most unequal, along with Bulgaria. Our income inequality went massive. Only the USA beats us in the rich world. We were very similar. But if you grow up in a time of great inequality and you were born in one, all your lives you've lived along those plateaus there with the Gini coefficient being very high. It's just normal to you. And you may not realise what is strange about it. But you are, in a sense, living in the 1930s again, in some really important ways. Last time we were this unequal. One of my impressions coming here today, going into Emmanuel College, was just how many people are being paid to walk around in overalls and uniforms. Now, they can't all be fixing the buildings all the time. And I think it's great for jobs, but it also kind of gives you a sense of there are the lower orders fixing the things for you. You know, you no longer have your personal scout and your personal cleaner, but the inequalities, certainly in terms of income, are back to what they were. Positionality. Newcastle, 1986. I probably learned more by spending 10 years in the city of Newcastle than by anything I learned how to say Newcastle, by the way. It's not an affectation. I grew up with a yokel accent, Oxfordshire, like that. But 10 years in Newcastle, and you can say Class and Bath and Newcastle correctly, because you have to, essentially. Newcastle was the geography department I discovered, where people didn't necessarily want to be there. And this is the beginnings of me talking about class differences. I really, really wanted to be in Newcastle. I had a lovely mother, but she was domineering. Oxford was a tiny town of 6 state schools. It felt small. I wanted to get away, and I wanted to get so far away that she couldn't get to me in a day and come and check what I was doing. And I didn't want to leave England. So there was only one option, right, which is Newcastle was far enough. And it was my first choice. I discovered when I turned up there very slowly that it wasn't the first choice of many of my contemporaries. Because back then, and it may not be the case now, from the elite schools, you get a choice. You get a couple of choices. Your first choice is it going to be Oxford or Cambridge? Right? One or the other, but the school pressure is really high. Some of you may have had that. I'd be interested, but I'm going to end on time. Some of you may have had huge pressure that you had to put down Oxford or Cambridge. And then the choice, I'd love to know whether it's still the same, is you get a choice of 3 and you can pick the order. And they're Bristol, Durham and Exeter. Right? But you get to choose where to put them. And then there's your reserve. And back in the 1980s, the reserve was Newcastle. So there were more than one boy from Eton in my class, which was a real education. And I'm a posh boy. They were lovely boys from Eton, partly because they'd let themselves down, they'd let their family down, and they'd let the school down. But they weren't bullies at all. They weren't bullies at all. And they made me feel not posh for the first time in my life because I was the poshest boy in my comprehensive. Right? Positionality is really complicated. Two detailed tables for you just about the kind of thing we don't do in geography in Britain and then why don't we do it. This is 2019. It's from the British Household Panel Study. It's about basic things about the population. Second line down. How many people have got 1 or more bills in arrears? They're having trouble paying their bills. For the bottom quintile of the population, it's 53% if you're very quick. The next, it's 33%. If you go up to the top quintile, it's 0. Right? No, but now, you may not know this, you may not think it, and you may not believe me, but almost all of you will come from families that are in the top quintile. There'll be people in the room who think I'm one of the poorest here. I came from a poor background, and relatively to other Cambridge students, you will have done, but very, very likely you were in the top quintile. In London, the top quintile is bigger than the quintile because London's richer. Go down to the bottom. And the kind of thing I think we ought to teach that really matters, and the yellow highlight. This is what proportion of children are in these quintiles. And this is 2019, so you were children at this time. 26% were in the bottom quintile of households, 25% in the next. Add 26 and 25 and you get 51. A majority of children growing up in the UK, a majority of your contemporaries, grew up in households in the bottom 2/5 of society by income. Right? But you are unlikely, just like me and my children, who are your age, by being the most unequal country in Europe, we are also the most spatially segregated. This is really interesting, geographically, but we don't tend to study it very much, because it's close to the bone. Last table, just to give you why this kind of thing matters. People who we've found with children who would like to have a holiday a year, just one holiday, just for a week, away from family and friends, could be in a tent. People who'd like to have a holiday but can't afford it. The total at the very end was 36%, it's now a bit higher. But for those bottom 2 quintiles, which contain the majority of children, it's 62% and 44%. And if I was lecturing on you on this, I'd be telling you, and what's really important is that this is people who say they would actually like a holiday. There are increasing numbers of parents who, when asked, can you afford to have a holiday, tick, we don't need one. What's that? Because that's what you get in a country that's poor with widening inequalities. You get very, very different experiences. It's kind of obvious. And it can be a bit depressing. It doesn't all have to be depressing. Now, geography. Okay, I've got 2 sources for you about us. The first is from the Sutton Trust. We now get 100% data on students. And it's great on your postcode because you're all really, really careful. When you put your postcode and your address down when you apply to university, you get it right. Otherwise, you're not going to get the offer. Okay? It's brilliant data. It's linked to school records in many cases. It's linked to what people do later, at least for first job. That's a bit more dodgy. But then it gets linked to HMRC records, so we can actually see what incomes people get. So when the Royal Geographical Society advertise geography and say you should consider doing geography at university because geography is in the top 10 for incomes, along with studying finance and economics and medicine, geography just is in the top 10 degrees to get the highest income later. We know that because we have linked record HMRC tax records. Why is geography in the top 10 for incomes? Why are you, and Cambridge you're more likely, going to end up, some of you, with a well-paid job? The horrible thing about inequality is the unnervingness, the precarity. Also, by the way, in case you're worrying about it, the ones with the high-paid jobs aren't necessarily going to be happy. They'll get divorced. Anyway. But in a normal country, you don't face this. And you have to laugh about it, but you will be coming back to alumni dinners in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years' time. You'll come back because you're nosy. And somebody will be a cabinet secretary, and somebody else will have made 20 million. And somebody else will be a geography teacher and feeling hard done by, despite the fact that a teacher puts you in the top 7 for society. Anyway, we've got very good data. This is free school meals. It's people who've had, I think, at least 1 in 6 years, but basically have ever had a free school meal. And it's the bottom of a graph. And geography was doing just better than veterinary science in the early 2000s. That means we had slightly more, almost 2%, 1 in 50 geography students had ever had a free school meal. Almost 2%. The dark blue bar is the 2/10s, and it rose because we had widening access and lots of positive discrimination and lots of trying to get people into universities, and so geography nationally touched 2%. Look, I mean, that might be an extra child, to be honest, or 2. But the vets did better, so geography didn't do as well as veterinary. So we have a posh subject when it comes to who's ever had a free school meal. There's the overall graph from the Sutton Trust. It's not all subjects, it's the top 10 and bottom 10. And you can see geography was next to the bottom one, and then now it's flipped over. Okay, so in the latest data, we'd won. You get lots of stories about geography. This is one from The Guardian, and I just put their illustration that The Guardian used. Okay, that's the picture in The Guardian newspaper to talk about how geography is great because it gives you an idea of the wider world. Which it does, except who are you and who is teaching you? Right? Imagine that all your lecturers were men, which at Newcastle, apart from Janet Monson, all mine were men. Right? Imagine we were all men. But we're very, very liberal men, and we can teach you about what it's like to do housework and so on. So it'll be fine if we're all men. Well, the point I'm trying to get to is, if your subject and your academics all tend to come from an extreme of one social group, it will have an effect. And then the question is, well, why do we have this, but then what is the effect? And I cannot help but look at the contents of geography journals and think, we're doing some of these esoteric things because people don't feel the need to do other things because they've never experienced problems that most people have. I've got a big table. I'm going to start at the bottom of it. This is the last table. Then there's a bit of waffle, and I'm going to ask you to ask me questions. I like this table because it's 100% data. It's for the year 2019. I'm stopping in 2019 because I'm lazy. I'm stopping in 2019 because I want to tell any of you that wants to do their dissertation on this, you'll be doing completely new research. I haven't looked, nobody else has looked since 2019. I'm also stopping in 2019 because there was a little thing called a pandemic, and that will have had an effect on who got what grades and who got in, which is temporary, but we know that for the first few years it won't have got better. There are 86 university degrees by UCAS number in the UK which have at least 500 students. So we're going to look at those 86 degrees. And I've ranked them by the ratio of the proportion of how many undergraduates come from the best of fifth of areas. This is by access, but it's almost identical to income and wealth. By the best of fifth of areas to the poorest fifth of areas. Now remember, actually 26% of kids come from those poorest areas, and only I think it was 15% on that table. But so it's the ratio of how many children, if you like, from the streets that are poor, the fifth of streets, to the streets which are the most affluent, fifth of households. And these ratios at the bottom are around 1 or less than 1. So these are the only subjects where it's kind of like 50-50, normal. If we had a kind of utopia, and nowhere has it, by the way, the biggest inequalities in the most equal country in the world, which is Finland, the biggest inequalities are university access, interestingly. Anyway, these are the most equal subjects: social work, games, something to do with law but not a law degree, so no LMAT, social policy, forensic archaeological science, nursing, studies and education, which you might expect. The next 10. And we're now getting up to ratios not quite 2 from the richest areas to 1 from the poorest. Trainee teachers, dance, some computer sciences. Interestingly, fine arts up there, thanks to the Open University and their massive fine art course. If you do fine art, by the way, at the Open University, you can get in without A-levels. Right, tell anybody who finds it hard. But do you know anybody who didn't get A-levels? Anyway, you can do fine art at the OU without A-levels. Do 1 year at the OU and you can switch to another degree. Anyway. Sociology. 2 undergraduates from the richest fifth of areas for every 1 for the poorest. I'm looking at that 2.10 in the middle. If I had my way, because my background is quantitative, you'd all be so used to looking at numbers, you'd be sick of it. Okay? But sociology 2. Let's go up again. Journalism 2.3, I'm just picking ones. Pharmacology and so on, heading towards 3 to 1. These are degrees where you're likely to get a job, or you think you get a job, or there's an obvious job to get. And also degrees where the entry requirements are less. I'll give you a clue as to why geography isn't there. For 10 years before I came to Oxford, 12 years ago, I lived in Sheffield. And one of my best friends was a teacher called Carl Lee, and I wrote a book on geography with Carl. And Carl was the A-level teacher for 3/4 of Sheffield. The other quarter on the hill, the affluent part of Sheffield, had geography A-level in all its schools. 6 state schools with incredible records. Better than any state school in Oxford, because Sheffield has only 1 semi-decent, tiny girls' private school with, I think, 60 girls going in a year. But if 3/4 of a city like Sheffield are basically not being offered a geography A-level, you can begin to see where the pattern comes from. Let's go up. We will get there. Music, aerospace, engineering, English studies, we're getting to 3 to 1. I shouldn't draw this on, but architecture, interestingly, only 4 to 1. Marketing, around about 4 to 1. Combination of physics, maths, and computer sciences, 4 to 1. The number of students is 640. I'm taking that. You can all the data's there. We're almost at the top 20. Maths, 4.64 to 1. So quite a geeky subject, quite a useful. I mean, really, you get a maths degree, you should be pretty sorted in life. But that's the ratio nationally for all of the UK. Physics 4 to 1 at the very bottom. Okay. And then into the last 20, going up from the bottom, degrees in building, in finance. Science that's aquatic or terrestrial, environmental, combinations of weird subjects, politics, geology, law with business study, combination of social sciences, physical, geographical sciences, 6 to 1. Philosophy, 6.6 to 1. And there we go at the end. Okay? Now, why did I highlight this in a paper in 2019? Because this is exceptional. It's exceptional. To rank, a subject has to rank first out of 86. You'd expect it to be a slightly smaller subject, not to have 2,245 students studying it. I have very kindly made up a subject called Combined Geography, which doesn't exist on the UCAS codes, which is in bold. When I was an undergraduate, it was the physical geographers who were slightly more likely to wear Rowan trousers, which probably means nothing to you, and like stomping, and we always thought they came from slightly bigger houses, but we may have been wrong. I first looked at this kind of thing in Newcastle because in Newcastle with Stan Openshaw, we had the first postcode profiler invented in the geography department, of course, where we could put in somebody's postcode and find out basically how posh they are. And they designed it, Martin Charlton and Stan, neither of them were with us, rather like a slot machine where 3 dials span. And the first one was from 1 to 7 or something, and then the next was from more, and the next one. And if you hit the jackpot, you got 111 for the top postcodes. And this is long before GDPR in the 80s. We put the entire undergraduate intake of Newcastle University through it, and we're shocked to find that the geography degree of students of Newcastle, mine, were the most affluent by background. And then I moved to Bristol. And it was the same for Bristol. They made me admissions officer at Bristol Geography Department because I was the youngest and most naive lecturer. This is in the 90s. We used to get 2,000 applications for the 100 places. Your chances of getting in were only 1 in 20. Oxford, it's 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 4. Manchester Met, it's 1 in 4, 1 in 5. I haven't checked Cambridge. You're odds on to get an interview. You're the ones who've not only got an interview, but just so you don't sleep at night, there are 2 people who for the rest of their lives will think, what did I get wrong in that interview to mean I'm not here? But anyway, you were all odds on to get an interview. Bristol, even back in the 90s, the intake was more privileged than Oxford and Cambridge. So at one point, my department had 2% of the entire sixth form of the top public schools. We had 1 child apply from the bottom half of all schools in Britain out of 2,000 applications. I managed to double, anyway, 2. Sorry. So there's human and social geography. 12 students nationally in an average geography department from the leafiest suburbs for everyone from the least leafy. And this is an average geography department. What does it mean? You know, dentistry's not far behind. There's the vets, there's the people studying classics at university, and there's the economists. Okay? And languages. Now, social sciences tend to be something done by the affluent. Partly because we can afford to do it, we tend not to be worried about what's going to happen to us next. We're going to get a job. By the way, the reason why geographers are in the top 10 for salaries is banking. And that will be because of the crack courses on banking that they're giving you here. So that when you go into a bank, you're going to be really, really good. It's amazing. We don't teach geographers anything about banking, but a significant number end up working in it. How could that be? What is the connection? Now, this has been going on for a long time. Right? I told you my great aunt went to Somerville. My grandfather went to Jesus College, Oxford, to study geography in 1935, I think. In the 1930s, geography was a lower middle class subject. It's what you did because you get a job. The job would be becoming a colonial officer. That's why we started the geography department in Oxford. But slowly over time, the intake has changed. But this intake has been like this for 20 or 30 years. Which means that the people who go on to do masters internally, the people who do PhDs, the people who become lecturers, and the people who write textbooks will also come from this background. To give you an extreme example of a 12-to-1 ratio, it's similar to apartheid South Africa. Now imagine if you had a department in South Africa where all your lecturers were white South Africans, but you said, but don't worry, they'll be able to emphasise, and all they've got to do is think about their positionality, and then they can talk about South Africa and it'll be fine. Right? That's kind of happened in geography. And I feel confident saying it because to do a master's, normally your mum and dad have to pay, right? So immediately we have a bar where if they can't pay for the master's, you're not going to do that. PhD, nationally, only 17%, about a seventh, of PhDs are near 6 of PhDs are funded by the Research Council. 5 out of 6 social science PhDs, their parents are paying their fees. Right? After a PhD, or even to finish one, you need to be a researcher. And that's precarious, so somebody's got to look after your rent. So the filtering through, now you start off with this ratio, and you're going to get a very weird situation. There's a lovely book written in 1968 with the title The Rich, about America, which ironically was written at the point when the rich never had less, which said, what can the rich do? And they can run art galleries, but one thing you could do in 68 is become an academic, because it gave you something to talk about at dinner parties. And this sounds slightly ironic, but if you go to some London departments, often, and we know this from the survey, often the academics are the lower paid of two people, and that's why they can work in London. It changes the nature of what you're doing. Let's skip over that and skip over that. Now, part of the reason I'm going on about this is when I wrote this quite carefully written article in an obscure journal, thinking it would only be read by other geographers, if at all, I didn't think that the Sun and the Daily Mail would get hold of it, okay? But they did. And as a result of that, a letter was written complaining about what I'd done by 89 geographers in 2019, including 59 heads of department, which must be most heads of geography departments. And you can see, I haven't put the letter there, but you can tell from the web address, the headline was, Geography degrees are preparing disadvantaged students for relevant careers. Now that would be correct if they'd said student, singular. Because on average they had one student who you could call disadvantaged per department. What had happened was that geographers think this is what they're doing because they have to deal with situations where a student runs out of money. Mum and dad get divorced is the normal reason. They've done lots of widening access. But they also absolutely hate quantitative data and don't believe it. Even if it's 100% UCAS records that couldn't be better, we've never had data like this before. Or they think you're talking down the subject. But in terms of positionality, it matters so much more the sea you swim in than your own actual position. It will change how people think, what is taught, what matters. So things like the environment really, really matter, whereas something like insecurity and precarity or fear of unemployment matter less. I'm not saying the environment doesn't matter, but when we look at surveys of what matters across the population, it tends to be the richest who worry most about the environment. That was the text that annoyed somebody in the article. This is only really English for most British geography. Geography is a very different subject in the USA. It's not a main subject. It's something you might take as a minor at university in the USA because you could do GIS, because you might get a job surveying, okay? It's not the same. And one reason we've got to this position is that geography is not an international subject, not like politics or economics or sociology. Right? The other major departments in the world, after the ones in the UK, are in ex-colonies. So it's Hong Kong, right? It's a bunch in Australia, a bunch in New Zealand. Right? And that, I think, can have an effect. So my worry is, I honestly think this matters. We shouldn't forget about it. If any of you were to get the UCAS data, it's publicly available, it's on Tableau. I can, not a very good web address for you, but it's not hard to find access. You will almost certainly find that geography is no longer the top of 86 degrees, just by chance, but also probably by a little bit more action than normal to try and do something about intake and alter what's happening. I think it explains more than anything else, but I can't prove it, why the subject has moved to teaching certain things and why we don't, for instance, decide that you've all got to learn climate change to a fairly good level in your first year. I think it's because of the gentrification of a subject, and you're in a gentrifying subject. It will change. It's probably already changing quickly. I may have overstated the importance of it, but I can't think that it doesn't help to know, if you're trying to understand, right up to the level of why are they setting these questions in the exam paper? And if you want, there are many reasons, but if you want to think, why are the questions like that for my degree? It's because of what's happened to the subject. And it isn't just a normal story, which is, we're so much better than we were in the past. We're so much cleverer. We went through that revolution of thinking and that revolution, but now we're giant philosophical minds and we do more than human or whatever it is. Sorry, fans of more than human. This is what happens if a subject gentrifies. All subjects have this thing of wanting to go forward and be fashionable and to kick back at what their PhD supervisors did and do something cleverer. But I honestly think human geography in particular has gone down a niche which is almost kind of like art gallery. Physical geography, slightly different, and I should try and get the data, but again, if any of you are interested, you can do it better than me. I think an increasing proportion of our physical geography lecturers did not do a degree in geography. They did a degree in physics or mathematics or chemistry. And geography is a nice place for them to be, to do their science. But that needs to be checked. But it would help explain why do we have such a division in the subject between human and physical now. And it's partly a social subject that we can explain partly by background, and what's really nice about that 12-to-1 measure is it's a geographical measure. It's based on postcodes and other things. It was actually invented by my PhD student Mark Corver in the early 2000s, trying to work out incentives for universities to widen their access for HEFCE. So it's a geographical measure that tells us about what has happened in the subjects. But I'm always coming to an end, so you need to think of questions. We're not that different from another bunch of subjects. There they are up there. Because the country has become so unequal, the profile of who does what kind of degree has become more unequal than it used to be. Of course, it used to be more of the rich because fewer people went, and it used to be more men. But once you take that out, it used to be more spread. Now, to put it really crudely, I'll end on this. The top 10% of people in the UK, I'm well in there, all your staff are in there. If there are picket lines, everybody on the picket line is trying to defend their position on the top 10%, and making it harder for people who are paid much less to walk in the building, by the way. I am a member of the union. The top 10% in the UK take 40% of all income, leaving 60% for everybody else, for 9%. Once you get into that situation, you really want your children to be in the top 10%. So unless they're going to be a really successful builder or plumber or electrician, more successful than most, they need a degree. And if they're going to do a degree, that needs to be something like dentistry or medicine or economical and finance, or one of those ones with the connections or at the right universities, where it doesn't matter if you've learned Greek because of where you've learned Greek. It's people just trying to look after their families. But it doesn't necessarily end up with the best people to do medicine doing medicine. You should go into medicine if you want to spend the rest of your life with ill people. Right? That's really... And that's why many medics try and leave medicine after they become medic, because they finally realise what it's going to involve. you shouldn't go into medicine because you want to be well off. You should go into dentistry in a normal country because you really, really want to stop people's teeth hurting, not because you want 2 nice cars. If people go into dentistry because they're doing it because it's a well-paid job, they're not going to generally be good dentists. They're going to charge you for expensive private work, and they won't open up their lists for NHS patients. And you should do geography because geography is absolutely fascinating, because we make the A-level much more better, because it's about the future of the planet, because it's about climate change and inequality, because it matters more than anything else, not because your school or your parents thought you should do it, or because the RGS tell you it's going to get you a high-paid job in the future working for private equity. Okay? That's my view. I'll stop there. Thank you for tolerating me. Please ask me anything. At the back.
Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm particularly interested when you mentioned about Bristol, because I remember when I started my undergraduate there in 2018, I could not believe the level of kind of privilege that course still has today. So just to your point, it's absolutely still there today. I'm interested in the kind of esoteric practices that you talked about in geography journals, because as a physical geographer, I wonder if you could just explain what you meant by that. Is it kind of a gatekeeping type thing, certain ways that they sort of keep information or
okay, why
discipline? Does that
yeah.
make sense?
Why do I think this happened in that way? Certainly, by the way, to make you lot feel better, or maybe not, but you are on average less posh than Oxford undergraduates at my university, wait for it, who are less posh than Bristol, who are less posh than Oxford Brookes, our former polytechnic. So Oxford and Cambridge have gone out of their way to do more widening access, but partly because of the postgraduates. I won't say more. I think as the barriers came in, as you had, my generation, we didn't have to do a master's. So as the barriers having to do a master's came in, having to pay for a PhD rather than almost everybody in the past, you only did one if it was funded by government, which is the same for science at the moment and medicine. As the barriers came in, you get a more select group who very crudely tend to be actually less nerdy. So they don't tend to have learnt a computer program when they're 12 in their bedroom. Right? They had a social life. Right? So the amount of quantitative work disappears. And the niche activities, you can be an expert at a tiny little bit of geography in a comfortable kind of surrounding with your friends doing that kind of thing. And you're not... I think that is what has gone on. Whereas there was a period before me. The lecturers who taught me were of a lower social class on average than our social class, than mine. They were very often the first in their family to have gone to university. They partly couldn't believe they were there. And it wasn't just a job for them, it was an absolute vocation. And many of them told me that they were shocked when they lived longer than their fathers and anybody else in their family had ever lived, and when they became middle class. Whereas from a different social group from whom we now take the majority of our researchers and academic staff, there's nothing abnormal about being an academic. One of your parents might have been one. It's not as good as running the art gallery on the Serpentine or at the V&A or having a mid-rank post at the BBC. Right? It's a different thing. And it probably isn't that weird vocation, obsessional thing that led, for instance, to my supervisor, Stan Openshaw, getting all the postcodes for the first time on hundreds of magnetic tapes, linking it to a census. It was really hard the first time this was done. This poor man was working overnight on his academic studies. Because nobody in his family had ever had the privilege to be able to do this. Everybody had had to do a manual job before. And I think that's if you change the social class of who the workers are, it's now much more work-life balance, You shouldn't be obsessional, but study more of the finer things in life quite often. I think that's happened. I don't want to be mean to my colleagues. And I'm from a family that is posher than almost all my colleagues in my department, which is why I'm comfortable talking about this. And it's much harder for somebody, I think, from a working class background to talk about what it feels like to work in geography. So I'm happy. But I think this is what's occurred. It's gentrified. And that's part of the reason why there is so little quantitative geography anymore. You're not taught how to use the census, I guess. You may be. At the back?
So I want to drag on the same topic. I suppose my question would be in regards to the whole esotericism in the department. And I feel like I'm always reading these articles that you want to make geography more relevant, and I feel like we're always coming to what are quite horrifying implications in our work about the state of the world and the climate. But do you think that in some way geography doesn't actually want to become more relevant and less esoteric because we are all, as I am, we are all so comfortable in our positions that even though we're doing these things, it's kind of scary to actually be relevant and actually have agency in changing those things. Even if the research says we need to do that, but our own selves.
It's our own selves and the collective from other people that we get. So, for instance, if you do work on the effects of poverty or child poverty, if you've actually seen it in your childhood or your siblings have, your sense that this really matters is so different. But if you're studying cancer and you know somebody who died of cancer, it's very different how seriously you take your work than just this is an interesting problem. And so for a lot of those issues, it changes how much it matters. And academia is still this weird thing, which is partly vocation and drive. I mean, the other thing that's happened, which makes things much harder for people, is expansion. In a way, it was so easy in the 80s to come up with new ideas because there were less ideas that had been come up with and there were fewer people. I'm extremely glad I'm not a 25-year-old academic now. Except, of course, in geography, you could do something very new by worrying about the core issues about people's... Take flags. Why was it flags this summer? Why was it orchestrated riots last summer? That's a really important geographical issue for Britain. The riots last summer were almost all above the north-south divide line, all in areas of high index of deprivation, almost to the point that somebody sat in Mayfair and worked out where to do in social media to orchestrate them. But why not study something that's very, very geographical? By the way, there were fewer flags in Stoke last week when I was there than there are in Oxford. Somebody's being paid to put those flags up. But incredibly important issue to the population. Or political geography, voting. Simple stuff that we used to have about understanding that. But if you've got less skin in the game and you're not afraid yourself and you think your life's going to be comfortable, then you can study. Nobody should have done this, I should be fine. The meaning of Afghan rugs being sold in Kensington. And an article in Area on it. Sorry.
How do you suggest that we account for and tackle non-economic forms of disadvantage and inequality?
This is primarily an economic form. The biggest one over the last 100 years is men and women. And in some ways, a majority of that has been tackled over proportions. My university for 20 years stood at 50-50 and is now 55% female. It should be 70. We massively positively discriminate for men. I don't know if Cambridge does. Going to worry the men in the audience. You're probably allowed in with slightly lower GCSE results than the women here. There's a reason why men do worse at GCSE. It's to do with being 16 and 15. But the other big one that's always mentioned is ethnicity. And partly because London does so well, You have to take out London doing well to work out what's going on there. I'm probably another really obvious one is age. You know, why on earth are you all this age? You know, it's really hard, by the way. Apologies to the people who are in their 30s or 40s in the room. You just look young to me. Okay, it's really hard teaching older people because they know stuff. But we're not the traditional old. The reason why there was a lecture theatre here was to train a cadre of people to run an empire. That's why we had the subject. And they had to be young because you want to get the most out of them economically. There's no need anymore to have such an age discrimination. But, yeah, and that's a huge one that we tend not to see. Going through disability, I really, I'm going to stick they make me chair so many equality committees because I write books on equality. We're very, very bad at quite severe disabilities, and I get in trouble if I say that some disabilities are more severe than others, but disabilities that make it very hard for you to move around in ancient medieval towns. There's a 5-minute commute in Oxford for students that takes somebody in a wheelchair 2.5 hours. And it's there's also, if you want to ask about why you shouldn't have interviews, there is an interview effect, which is cheekbones and looks and so on, and it's possible to prove it, and that's an only slightly hidden one, but I personally would not have interviews, and that goes on later. So job interviews. If you tended to look like, I won't put my foot in it anymore, but it's very hard not to have job interviews. But there are lots of non-economic disadvantages that we don't even recognise, like looks and confidence and charisma and things, or age. So at the back.
Yeah, you made clear how inequality is such a societal issue, but what do you think we could actually do on it or individually
To combat. I would think, so geography departments are in a kind of position of power at the moment. They get lots of students. Remember, outside Oxford and Cambridge, we have the worst crisis on our universities we've probably ever had. Not quite yet as measured as bad as the 80s, but it almost certainly will. There are universities losing 1 in 4 of their staff. And it's all happening quietly because the minute you know that that university is in worse trouble. We're getting universities merging, all the senior leadership. But geography does well. We could tinker more with the intake. We could require a bit more on the sciencey side, which would alter the social class differences. And just by having different people in the room, that changes the positionality of the people for more privilege. But not one person, has to be a few more. But I do think because the subject, climate change is terrible, but absolutely brilliant for geography, and it's not going away. So there is the kind of 50-year game plan. But I'm being cynical, but also it really matters. Nobody should graduate from a degree in geography, I would say, without a fairly in-depth knowledge of the science of climate change. And if you can't do that and do your qualitative work as well, but then somebody else can. So that's the kind of thing I'd push. It might also help to integrate human and physical geography a bit more because it's a completely separated subject. Should we just take a couple? Well, I've got 3. Got about 5 minutes to hit the hour, but go on.
How do we make geography reach out to, you talk about the ratio of 12 to 1. How do we reach out to the 1? Because I'm from Stoke, I went to the school you went to, I think.
Same as you and Robbie Williams?
Yeah.
The Catholic one?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
There's real problems there that I don't see addressed in the sort of current geographical literature, you spoke about flags, etc.
Yeah.
How do we reach out and actually leave these comfortable niches and talk about the things that are affecting working class people and get these people actually interested
in doing it? So it's a big one. you need to edit the school Wikipedia page so as you are, not just Robbie Williams, that's the only fact. That's only fine. Okay. It's not immediate, but that doesn't matter, right? People always get frustrated and they think we can't change anything fast. Michael Gove wouldn't let me on the curriculum review 12 years ago in the Secretary of State for Education. The A-level's got to be made more interesting. It's a boring A-level, okay? It is a boring A-level. And the GCSE could be made more relevant and interesting. The people who influence the syllabus of the A-level are quite old fuddy-duddy geographers, and it's partly, they're quite old, which is really, they're going to be new people, but actually becoming really interested in that teaching geography, which is unfashionable, which used to be a bigger part of the subject, and trying to get involved in changing the syllabus so that it's not the one that makes people go to sleep. And that matters as much as then worrying about the intake and the subjects we do. It mustn't be the subject you do at A-level. If you're a little bit weak overall, but with some coaching, you'll be okay. And to answer your 9-point question on space and place, this is what you write. Right? It's got to be something you actually want to go to. And it should be. It should be, you can't make chemistry that exciting. You've actually got to learn it. But the fact that some kids say that maths is more interesting than geography is a tragedy. But universities can influence what the schools do. The schools are deciding that it's free exam boards, and they're largely serving, in a way, the schools. There's a kind of level of corruption between certain schools that rely on geography a lot. So I've been 3 times to Eton. There's a geography house at Eton. There's a board outside which says who got A stars and who got A's. Nobody ever gets a B. Right? So the problem is we've got to change it from a subject in which it's possible to teach so nobody gets a B. There are more other schools I know with 10 geography teachers, to a subject which is interesting, but you might not always get an A if you're coached. And that's the danger of what the subject part of the game. The RGS and the GA really won't like me saying this, but, and it's comfortable. And it shouldn't be like that. It should be challenging and interesting to do. Sorry.
At the risk of proving the point of geography being very comfortable and making up its own words, do you think as a possible explanation for why geography is so going into the higher end jobs and is taking from the more privileged backgrounds is to do with the neoliberalisation of degrees, the idea that you're now getting a degree to get a better job? Do you think there's some kind of feedback there? Is there some kind of specific element about geography that's leading to people who are going to go on and work about getting this degree because it's now gamified, it's a system rather than a free thing that you can do because you're interested in it?
Yeah, well, the example I can give which fits for you is I did a PhD at a time when very few people did, and it was seen as a stupid thing to do because you wouldn't get on the housing ladder, and academic salaries were going down, and Margaret Thatcher had not funded universities because Oxford wouldn't give her an honorary degree. So seriously, for 10 years in the 80s, there were no new posts apart from 1986, when they created 1 new post in some geography departments. So I did a PhD at a time when it was completely insane to do a PhD. I'm from a well-off family. I never even thought. I thought I was going to just go and travel around the world with my girlfriend after this. And that shows how arrogant and how little I had to worry about. PhDs were done by people who really wanted to do a PhD because they were really interested in the subject. Whereas now you know what the word PhD means. And it's almost like the ultimate qualification. If you want to be a top perfumier in Paris, get yourself a PhD in geography and anything, and you're Dr. So-and-so. And if they ever ask you to take another qualification, well, you're a doctor. But that is the ultimate what's happened to PhDs. My children must have PhDs. It's also one thing that's unique to Britain in Europe is almost all the rest of the mainland doesn't charge, including not charging postgraduates and including paying PhD students and salaried staff, so not students. And Scotland's the same. So we've gone down the American model of if you pay, you pass. As soon as you pay for education, you might not notice this, if you pay, almost nobody fails. So if you're paying to a private school, you will pass, because that's the point. And if you pay for a degree, you will get a degree, because you can't charge people and not. Ultimately, that's the problem with having privatised education. Some people go, oh, what exactly are you learning? It's not quite as bad as you all using AI, and us all using AI to mark you. But the problem is, why employ you? But it is bad. Should we just take two more? So there's one there.
Well, I once got asked, why did I come to the UK to study geography? Isn't it a very colonial subject? I was wondering what you think about the implications for geography departments like this, namely being previous British colonies.
Okay, the implications of it. I don't know. If I had longer, I'd go on and on and on. But I know most of you will want to get out. So I'll try and give you what may be the most interesting for me. I've got a friend who's from China, and she now lectures in a geography department. And she said the really interesting thing is how obsessed they all are with decolonisation. And the ex-colonies, but decolonisation. And she said to me, it's almost as if my colleagues don't know there is a large amount of the world out there which was never directly colonised, which was affected by the Western and was invaded and so on. But we've kind of managed to get to the point of decolonisation, but not yet gone beyond the British Empire, which I thought was interesting from a take from outside. And can you imagine coming from a country which has managed to make high-speed rail work everywhere, and has public toilets every 50 metres, and has almost no crime, and a slightly authoritarian government, but not as bad as the USA. You don't see ICE. Okay? Can you imagine coming from that and the biggest improvement in living standards in human history, and then working here and having to be told what a terrible place you come from? It's really colonial. The BBC reporting on China is just childish, I would say. I might get in trouble, but just at a certain level, it's childish. And if you were following the scandal about the two spies this week, what is the biggest enemy? Anyway, and geographers, these are the really interesting questions that are bigger than just, let's admit to what we actually did in what was once called Rhodesia, or what the torture in Kenya, or look at the Middle East, and let's just remember who drew those boundaries, okay? Right? There's lots of that to learn. There's a whole incredible history that we haven't been taught to learn, but there's a bigger one even than the British Empire and decolonisation. And the planet isn't that huge. So we'll take one last question. We had you before? No. Okay, let's do you.
I'm just wondering, do you know the statistics of the median average earning after graduating a number of years? Was that ever divided up, or a way to divide that up in terms of the polar?
Oh, about the polar.
Yes. Code to kind of see.
Yes.
So you come from this background going into your degree.
Yeah.
What was your average earning rather than
before?
The
Yeah.
average?
Okay, and I can do this quite quick. Yes, it's really, really heavily influenced. So the degree doesn't have that much effect unless you do something like medicine, where there's a kind of floor level that you're to get. But the background is huge prior to the degree. The effect is large, and it's being published. But the most important thing about degree effects, and not to get you worried, but all these statistics that tell you how much money you're going to earn, are all based on past data. Now, 50% of people go to university in the UK by the age of 18. It's about 66% now, 2/3 by the age of 30. That only leaves a third. And that third who don't go includes some people on very good salaries doing really, really useful things. Right? The people who can actually make this city work. Right? Most of them didn't go to university, and most of them will command 40, 50, 60, 70, 80,000. And they fix the electrics and everything else. So the 2/3 who've gone to university cannot earn much more than the third who didn't, or even more, without making that third into serfs. That's not possible. So you're going to have equality forced upon you. And just to make it even more likely, we've got to give you a student debt. For those of you who are paying it, unanswered, well, I won't do it. Imagine if I said, okay, put up your hand if mum and dad are paying your fees. We don't even talk, about 30% in the room. Didn't tell you that. Okay, in a lower grade university, it can be just 5 or 2%. And that has a huge effect later on in your life. But we old, nasty people have taken away your future wealth. We've taken away your degree advantage. In a sense, we've fostered equality upon you so that we can still have our cruise holidays later. We haven't paid for your degrees out of taxation. We have the lowest taxation in Europe, even though it's the highest for 70 years. We're making you go into debt, most of you, but not all of you. We're making you go into debt so that you can be here and you can pay that debt off. But the great thing is, that means that you're not going to be buying my house when I need to go in a home for the amount of money that I think I want for it, because you're not going to have that money. Right? So there is an equality coming almost inevitably, despite the fact that the people whose parents are richer, their children will get better jobs because they'll get them into the internship, because they will look after them when they're in internship, or just because, really, really simply, you come from a 4-bed house in a nice part of London, and when you finish this degree, there's a bedroom for you for as long as you need, and you can live rent-free and work in W1A for the BBC or whatever. Whereas if you've come to Cambridge and you've come from a 3 or 2-bed house up north in a town without middle-class jobs, that's your future. Doesn't matter whether you get a first or a 2-1, right? The postcode is the key to what's going to tell me your future. And rather than get depressed about it, go, well, that's really, really interesting geographically. Let's actually try and get the Hefkin on my data and just work out how much of an advantage is having a certain postcode versus the degree results people get. Because it's when it becomes obvious that you begin to go, this is really, really stupid and really unfair. We've gone to 1:15. Thank you ever so much for your attention. Hope I haven't annoyed anybody.